In the Christian New Testament, there are a set of words attributed to Jesus that are sometimes called the harshness sayings. They're called that because, well, they suggest that Jesus was not the sort of person who made a lot of other people feel comfortable. He spoke truth to power. He wasn't always a polite dinner guest. And he told people that if they wanted to achieve the kingdom of God, then they needed to radically change society and their lives. He suggested that in order to follow his teachings, they needed to shift almost everything about what they did. You might know a couple of the more famous of these harshness sayings. They're phrases like, "It's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. And if your right eye causes your downfall, tear it out and fling it away. And if anyone causes the downfall of these little ones who believe, it would be better for him to be thrown into the sea with a millstone around his neck." The harshness saying suggests that religious practice, as Jesus saw it, was not exactly an easy thing. It required personal sacrifice. It necessitated questioning everything about the way people did things. To be faithful, in his view, required a radical confrontation with the reigning world order. It meant uprooting the powers and principalities that organized human life and replacing them with something different. Such a religious view is in no way unique to Jesus. In the Hebrew Bible, we find prophets like Jeremiah who go about complaining how difficult it is for people to follow the teachings of God. In one passage, he travels the streets of Jerusalem, proclaiming, "Roam the streets of Jerusalem, search its squares, look about and take note. You will not find a man. There is none who acts justly, who seeks integrity, that I should pardon her." It was the religious task, the mission of prophets like Jeremiah to point out to the people of Jerusalem that they were not living in accordance to the will of their God. They needed to change everything about what they were doing. They were to live in accordance with the divine. Otherwise, Jeremiah warned, their civilization would face utter destruction. Again, we see in this prophetic tradition the idea that religious practice is not easy. It's something that requires a fundamental shift in the way that people are doing things. They need to reimagine their relationships with each other and with the divine if they are going to live faithfully. I've been thinking about the harshness sayings and the prophetic tradition the last couple of weeks as I've sought a Unitarian Universalist response to the climate emergency. As I mentioned last week, this year in worship, we're acknowledging that we as a human species face three intertwined crises that threatened our continued existence. These are the resurgence of white supremacy, the climate emergency, and the assault on democracy. At the root of all of these crises lie our imagined differences and our imagined separation from the earth. Addressing them as a religious community means asking the questions: how can we develop the spiritual and religious resources to face these crises? How can we imagine new ways of being and overcome our imagined differences and our imagined separation from the earth? Last week, we talked about disrupting white supremacy. This week, we're going to be talking about religious responses or religious ideas to help us address the climate emergency. And it's a good week for it. This coming Friday, there'll be the youth-led global climate strike. It's likely to be the largest climate action in history. The Unitarian Universalist Association is inviting Unitarian Universalists across the country to participate. Here in Houston, the staff of First Church is encouraging members and friends to join in those protests. On Friday morning, we'll be gathering here at 10 a.m., making signs, practicing songs, and then after a brief worship service led by our assistant minister, Scott Cooper, traveling as a group to City Hall. I hope that many of you will come. And immediately following the service, we're having a meeting to discuss the logistics. And one of the local organizers, Leah Miller, is supposed to be joining us. At the meeting, we'll also be talking about how you might participate if you don't feel comfortable skipping school or missing work. We want everybody to be able to express their distress about the climate crisis, and so our membership and communications coordinator, Alma Vizcarra, has developed a social media strategy for those of you who will be working on Friday. The more of us express our commitment to do something about the climate crisis, the greater the chances are that we collectively can do what needs to confront it. The coming global climate strike has largely been inspired by GretaThornburg. Greta is a 16-year-old from Sweden. Last year, she started skipping school once a week on Fridays to protest adult inaction on the climate crisis. Frustrated, angry, and more than a bit terrified of her future, she, by herself, sat down in front of the Swedish parliament and demanded that people start talking about the climate crisis. Within a few weeks, she was joined by other children from throughout Europe. On a regular basis, they began to climate strike and skip school. When Greta and those who joined her were criticized for neglecting their education, she responded, "And why should I be studying for a future that soon may be no more, when no one is doing anything to save that future? And what is the point of learning facts when the most important facts clearly mean nothing to our society?" I find a certain resonance between Greta's words and the harshness sayings of Jesus and the words of the prophets. In her speeches, she has repeatedly chastised adults for failing to address a profound threat to our current civilization and life on Earth. She says, "On climate change, we have to acknowledge that we have failed. All political movements in their present form have failed, and the media has failed to create a broad public awareness." Her words are an indictment for all of us who are over the age of 30 and who have failed to do nothing significant to address the climate emergency. During our lifetimes, the situation has grown more dire. We've known that carbon emissions are causing the Earth to rapidly warm for decades. And yet, over the last 30 years, humans have emitted more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than our species did over the prior 200. If we continue to emit carbon dioxide at this rate, then we'll have placed our planet on a path to warm by 2 degrees Celsius. And we'll have placed it on that path to do that within 10 years. And climate scientists have repeatedly told us that that will create a dire situation. Island nations will drown, coastal cities will flood, millions of people will be displaced, many millions more will starve as drought comes and renders some farmlands unproductive, nations will be destabilized, the refugee crisis will increase. It's past time to debate the science. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a body of the United Nations, has repeatedly made clear that there is an overwhelming consensus on the part of scientists about the state of the climate emergency. The author Scott Westerfeld has cheekily circulated a meme that summarizes how ridiculous many view it to debate the science. His meme reads, "Plot idea. 97% of the world's scientists contrive an environmental crisis, but are exposed by a plucky band of billionaires and oil companies." Besides, we've already begun to feel the impact of the climate emergency. Hurricanes like Dorian and Harvey here in Houston have become more frequent and more intense in recent decades as the Earth has warmed. At the same time, as many as 1 million species on Earth are threatened with extinction. Every day, as many as 200 species go extinct. Let me give you a few more words from GretaThornburg. "We are now at a time in history when everyone with any insight into the climate crisis that threatens our civilization and the entire biosphere must speak out in clear language, no matter how uncomfortable and unprofitable that may be. We must change almost everything in our current societies." She starkly summarizes our situation this way: either we choose to go on as a civilization, or we don't. Either we choose to go on as a civilization, or we don't. I hear in those words echoes of the harshness sayings. I hear in them echoes of the prophetic traditions. But I want to suggest that there is a difference, and it is a theological difference. The harshness sayings of Jesus and the prophetic tradition have, for several centuries, been one of the major animating forces behind what we might call the apocalyptic story. This is a story in the Hebrew Bible and Christian New Testament that's probably familiar to most of you. It runs something like this. The world is caught in a cosmic struggle between good and evil. The struggle will ultimately result in a cataclysmic battle in which the forces of good will triumph over evil for all time. Humans will find themselves then in the heavenly city after God has vanquished the devil here on earth and in heaven. In many versions of the apocalyptic story, humans play little, if any, role in bringing about the ultimate victory of good over evil. The tradition of the prophets is often interpreted as meaning that God is the one who will bring about collective salvation. The harshness sayings of Jesus are frequently read in the same way. Apocalyptic stories are rooted in an idea that matter, that the earth itself is somehow fallen, corrupt, or sinful. Earthly matter, the material substance of which we are composed, passes away. Bodies decay and age. We have physical suffering. Death comes to all of us. Apocalyptic stories are predicated on the idea that it is possible to escape this material corruption. They rest upon the belief that matter and consciousness, body and soul, are two separate entities. They are based in a belief that human beings are somehow different from other animal species, and that the purpose of our existence, our reason for being, our salvation, individual and collective, has little to do with this loam and clay, this sand and stone, this soil and dirt upon which we place our feet. This view has been poetically expressed in the words of the old Texas songwriter Jim Reeves. "This world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue." In the European tradition, this idea goes very far back. One place we might find it is in the works of the philosopher Plato, a man so influential on European thinking that Alfred North Whitehead, another philosopher, once wrote, "All of the European philosophical tradition consists of a series of footnotes on Plato." Plato had the idea that the material world is but a shadow of a higher reality. This was a world of forms. This higher world was a world of forms. And he used a famous allegory to explain the distinction between the material world and the world of forms. Perhaps you've heard it. It's called the allegory of the cave. Imagine, he argued, that there are a group of prisoners chained in a cave. They are chained in such a way that they can only look straight ahead at a wall. They cannot turn their heads to see what's behind them. Behind them is a fire and a group of puppeteers with puppets. The puppeteers use the puppets to cast shadows on the wall in front of them. The prisoners can only see the shadows, not the objects that are creating them. They mistake the shadows for reality, when in truth the shadows were but a pale imitation of it. In Plato's reckoning, the shadows were matter. The things casting the shadows were pure being. Human beings were matter. They were transient, one-dimensional reflections of the pure being of the soul. Bodies died, souls were immortal. This division between the soul and body gave philosophy, in Plato's rendering, much of its purpose. Philosophy was meant to be a discipline whereby its practitioners could move beyond the illusions of materiality and immerse themselves in the contemplation of true reality. Socrates was another Greek philosopher. He was also Plato's teacher. In Plato's writings, he is frequently cast as the ideal philosopher. He's described as disassociating himself from his body and matter, choosing the contemplation of some ideal realm over a direct engagement with the earthly mess of daily living. In one of Plato's dialogues, he's described as someone who stands aside from his body insofar as he can. His alienation from his own body is so complete that Plato depicts him as caring as almost nothing about clothing, comfort, or even food. He can stay up all night thinking about philosophy, thinking about his soul, and never get tired. He's anything but an ordinary human. Socrates is weird, philosopher Martha Nussbaum describes him. Plato's transformed person, the one who has conquered their corruptible, transient material body, is very little like you or me. Faithful in his rendering to his philosophical ideas, takes him completely out of the earth on which he lives. This idea of the division between body and soul was taken up by many ancient Christian theologians. Augustine, who might be thought of as the father of Trinitarian Christianity, took the idea of the separation of body and soul and combined with the harshness sayings of Jesus and applied them to human history. He thought it was impossible for human beings to achieve God's vision of justice on earth. This was because he reckoned that our material reality had made us corrupt and imperfect. God, however, was incorruptible and perfect. There was no point in struggling for justice because humanity's corrupt nature would ultimately screw things up. The only thing we could do was wait for God to bring about the end of human history, and with it, eternal justice. And all of this, of course, was going to happen in a fairly short time. This apocalyptic view of history has been one of the central animating stories of our society since Augustine. And thinking about it, one might find resonances between apocalyptic stories and the current climate emergency. However, I detect meaningful distinctions. Accepting that we are in the midst of a climate emergency means embracing our material reality rather than rejecting it. It means recognizing that humans are collectively agents largely of our own historical destiny, rather than subject to some divine plan. Last week, I spoke about the need to find new ways of being in new religious narratives. These new ways of being and new religious narratives are connected to embracing our materiality rather than rejecting it. They require us to recognize that the earth is our home, that our treasure is here, not laid up in some cerulean ether, that we recognize that our actions, small and large, have an impact on this earth and on how the human story will progress or resolve itself. I had something of a little bit of an awakening to this over the summer when I was in Paris with my parents. We were there on one of our frequent European vacations. My father teaches abroad most summers, as you may know, and for much of my life I've spent the summer in Europe. This summer, the heat there in Paris reached unprecedented levels. For 3 days in a row, it was over 100 degrees. One day, it reached 108 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, Paris is not like Houston. It's not a city built with air conditioning. The apartment we were staying in did not have central heat. There was nowhere to escape the heat. Inside, it was hot. Outside, it was even hotter. Walking down the street or just moving was exhausting. As we suffered through that heat, I thought about the connection between air travel and climate change. Now, you might know that I'm a pescatarian, that I don't own a car, that I take public transit or walk most places that I go, that I don't buy a lot of new clothes. But even so, my love for travel has made my carbon footprint, my contribution to climate change, much larger than it should be. When I hear the harshness sayings of GretaThornburg, I hear talking to people like me, people of self-declared good conscience, people who understand themselves to have empathetic hearts. And I hear her saying two things. I hear her saying, you need to do all you can to work to confront the crisis we are in. If we do not resolve it now, it will fundamentally change the world we inhabit for the worse. And I hear her saying, you need to reimagine your own habits, your own way of moving through the world. It's a call to a new way of being, not one based in a rejection of material being, but in its embrace. It's a call I can hear also in the words of the poet Pablo Neruda, Es una copa llena de agua el mundo. The world is a glass overflowing with water, and recognizing that the earth itself is sacred. The author, Naomi Klein, has observed that this new way of being changes everything. There is a need, she writes, for breaking many rules at once, for shifting cultural values, for changing the way we understand the world, the narratives we have, and the actions we take. This can only be done through collective sacrifice and collective effort. We have made such sacrifices before. It might be possible to make them again. The people of the United States mobilized and sacrificed enormously to defeat fascism during World War II. Changed our consumer habits. Many started growing their own food. Many people even reorganized temporarily their family structures, sending women off to work in factories while men went off to war. Such collective sacrifice and effort is called for in legislations like the new Green New Deal. Its $10 trillion price tag has been called unrealistic, and yet recent history shows it is well within the range of the possible. The United States government spent somewhere between $3 and $4 trillion on bailing out the banks during the economic crisis. That same government spent as much as $6 trillion on the so-called war on terror. Now, my math might not be that good, but 4 plus 6, I do think, equals 10. So the question is not, do we have the resources to quickly attempt to shift society and address the climate emergency? The question rather seems to be, do we have the will to make the collective sacrifice and effort to do so? And I'm not going to pretend that I individually have that capacity. I find myself uncertain, to be honest, that I'm even yet willing to give up air travel. My parents and brother live in faraway states. Most of my good friends gather at academic conferences on a regular basis in different parts of the country. And I have to say, I enjoy seeing different parts of the world. And when I think about radically changing the way I do things, I find myself thinking of a line from, of all people, Augustine. Lord, make me pure, but not yet. But I also find myself thinking about words from GretaThornburg about hope, the possibility of change, and the ways that future generations might view us. Here are a few final words from her. The year 2078, I will celebrate my 75th birthday. If I have children, maybe they will spend that day with me. Maybe they will ask me about you. Maybe they will ask why you didn't do anything while there was still time to act. You say you love your children above all else, and you're stealing their future in front of their very eyes. Until you start focusing on what needs to be done rather than what is politically possible, there is no hope. After Greta's words, I choose to close not with a prayer, but an invitation. I invite you to join in a pursuit of new ways of being. I invite you to engage in collective action. And I invite you to work together to change everything and see ourselves as part and parcel of this material reality, rejecting old stories of separation of body and spirit, embracing this good green ball of a planet we call Earth. So please join me this week with First Church's staff, thousands of other Unitarian Universalists from across the country, and millions of other people throughout the world. Join with us in person if you can. Join with us virtually if you cannot. And so now I invite you to say, as a congregation, Amen.